So that leads us into real property valuations. Folks, I'm going to be completely honest with you. This is the last really sucky chapter. The rest of it is not as bad. Even though I'm telling you, there's still several more to get through between, Monday, Tuesday. The next grouping of slides are going to go a little bit faster. And so really and truthfully, we'll spend most of the time, the rest of the time tonight here and some of the time on Monday here, and then kind of, put a bow on it. But this is the last real big doozy chapter, if you will. And so real property valuations, let's get as much of it as we can done, is an important concept because you've got to understand the way that we help people price houses as real estate brokers. You've got to understand the way that appraisers do it for banks, the difference between the two. And I'm going to be honest with you that there is so much information in this section that should not be in this section. Okay, like I argue that this section is borderline cruel and unusual, not that the rest of them haven't been, just because it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for you to know any of this stuff, some of the stuff that I'm going to teach you. A lot of it's useful, some of it's not. So let's just start with an appraiser and an appraisal. When we say an appraisal, that is done by a licensed appraiser, and it is an opinion of value based on standards of practice by this licensed appraiser. Yeah, it's still an opinion. Folks, there is no such thing as absolutes. Everything that we do, appraisers do, we do is an opinion. It's an educated opinion. It's a, using standards of practice opinion, but it's still an opinion. Now, understand that we as real estate brokers are not allowed to do appraisals. Only a licensed appraiser can do them. And we are actually not even allowed to use the terms value. Only an appraisal can determine the value or worth of a property. What we as real estate brokers do, you've heard me say it multiple times, is the CMA, Comparative Market Analysis, sometimes referred to as a BPO, which is a broker price opinion. Now, when we do the CMA or the BPO, we're using the same standards of practice as an appraiser, but we just can't call it an appraisal. What ours determines is a probable sales price or a probable list price. Here's what we think it could sell for. Here's what we think it could list for, not what it's worth. Of course, sellers want to know, what's my home worth? And they'll ask us that. But what we're really answering is, what do we think we could list it for? That's what we're really answering. And so a couple pieces of clarity here. If you're dealing with North Carolina, the real estate manual, a CMA and a BPO have the same legal definition. For all intents and purposes, they're the exact same thing. The context in which we use the terms is the only differentiation. If I'm talking about doing it for a client, I would call it a CMA. If we're talking about doing it for a third party for a fee, we'd call it a BPO. Let me give you an example of that. It's not uncommon for banks, it's more uncommon now, but it wasn't uncommon back in the housing market crisis, for banks to reach out to real estate professionals and say, hey, would you give me a broker price opinion on 123 Main Street? Tell me what you think it could sell for. And they would commonly do that for a fee for this bank, and the bank wanted to know what they could sell it for if they had to foreclose or whatever. And so that's really it. I mean, they're the same thing. We use standards of practice and look at comparable sales to determine a probable sales price or list price. Legal definition is the same. However, here's the really big testable thing from a North Carolina point of view. A provisional broker cannot do a BPO for a fee. A provisional broker can do a CMA for their clients as part of their client services, but they cannot do a BPO for a fee. Meaning if the bank called a provisional broker and said, I'll give you $200 to do a BPO, a provisional broker couldn't do it. They're not allowed to in North Carolina. Full broker can, BIT can, but a provisional broker cannot. So here's the last word of caution. I don't know if they're going to be this mean, but the key piece is the fee. If they said, can a provisional broker do a CMA for a fee? The answer is still no. If they said, can a provisional broker do a BPO for their client? The answer is yes. The key piece is the fee. They cannot do it in direct exchange for a fee. because technically, like I said, BPO and CMA is the same legal definition. We typically use them in those two different contexts, but they're the same thing, really and truthfully. So just don't let them trip you up on the test if they try. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I want to get into the more nitty gritty stuff. These are just generic things. We talked about this very early on in the course. The characteristics of value. We had the acronym DUST, right? Demand. There has to be a need or a desire to buy for it to have value. Utility. Does it satisfy the needs of whatever it is? A house to live in, a land to use. Scarcity. The finite supply. The less of something there is, the more valuable it becomes. And of course, transferability. If you do not have the ability to sell or transfer it in the future, then it really has no value. It may still have utility. So we talked about this. Now, when we're talking about this CMA or BPO, which is a big part of this, please understand that, as I already clarified, they're not the same thing as an appraisal, and it will never be suitable for lending purposes. In fact, even an appraiser doing an appraisal that the bank didn't order is also not suitable for lending purposes. So, for instance, if a seller orders an appraisal before they list their home and a buyer goes to buy it, that buyer who's getting a loan is going to have to get a new appraisal. They will not use somebody else's. It has to be ordered by the bank. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier on, and so I just want to provide the clarification on the vocab differentiations when we're talking about value versus price versus cost. Market value is an appraiser's outlook. Okay. When an appraiser does an appraisal, they say, what would this property probably sell for in an open and competitive market with competent parties? Meaning they know what they're doing. The market is open. There's no swaying it. That is market value. What an appraisal determines is market value. When we use the term market price, that's what it actually sold for. Market price. Now, the other one that comes into place is what we call market cost. Folks, if you were to install a swimming pool right now, just to make it an easy example, you're probably going to spend for an in-ground swimming pool minimum $60,000 in today's day and age. I mean, they're getting pretty pricey up there, 60 grand. Now, here's my question. Do you think that if you spend $60,000 on installing a swimming pool, that increases the value of your home by $60,000? Negative, Ghost Rider. Does not. Say what?
No.
No.
Until you're expanding the square footage something, then the value is going to be increased.
Yeah, and please understand, a pool does add value, but it is never going to be a dollar for dollar, right? I mean, the very few things really are even close to dollar for dollar. And so that's what you have to understand about market cost. Just because something cost you $60,000 to do doesn't mean it made your house more valuable by $60,000. So market cost is what something costs, whether it was the house or a feature. Market price is what you could sell it for or what it sold for, and market value is what an appraiser thinks it's worth. And then, as we said, when we do a CMA, we are determining probable sales price or probable list price. Now, we didn't talk about this in great detail. I'm also not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because I do want to focus on the more in-depth aspects as we're, getting down to the last several days of class. I don't want to spend as much time on certain things that I don't think are as testable, so we have plenty of time for review that last night. Beverly says, is square footage addition a dollar for dollar ad? No, nothing is. So when we're talking about forces that influence value, a lot of different things. And as I said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there. Social forces, economic forces, political forces, physical forces, things that you probably wouldn't normally think of, folks. When we say social forces, marriage trends for a given area, divorce rates, family size, desirability of a locale. Is it safe? Is it, a good place to raise a family? Is it, got things to do? Same thing too, economic forces. Is there a lot of unemployment? Is there a lot of jobs? Is the pay enough to live there versus the cost of living. What are interest rates like? What are, taxes like, which could fall more into the political side of things. But certain areas, we've seen a lot of shifts where people were living in these very high cost areas for so long. And then when things started going a lot more remote, those areas kind of took a dip because people were like, well, why am I going to pay these crazy taxes? And why am I going to pay these crazy values when I can now work remote and I can be in a much more cost-effective place to live? So the political forces, red state versus blue state. Do you like the politicians? Do they have good planning boards? Do they have good developers? Do they have, good tax policies? Yet again, some states don't have income tax on, in those states. Some states have better real estate taxes than others. And then, of course, physical forces, all the external factors, location. What's it in close proximity to? Do you have highways? Is it easy to travel? Do you have, rough topography? Is it good weather? Is it bad weather? Do you have all 4 seasons? All of these things influence value of a given area. There is a lot of land out there in the world, but the affordable land is places people don't want to be. It's not desirable because it lacks a lot of these things that we would consider positive influences on these values. As I said, these are all just kind of generic understandings. Do you have to remember this list? No. But just having an understanding that all of these affects value. So let me ask you a question here. True or false, real estate agents use comparative market analysis to determine the probable market value of real property. I finally got y'all on one. Thank you, Jesus. Folks, read it again. And I didn't get everybody. A couple of you said false. Read it again. Why is it false?
Because it's used to determine the probable selling price.
There you go. A real estate agent uses a comparative market analysis to determine a probable sales price or a probable list price, not market value. Value is an appraiser. We cannot use the word value as real estate brokers. There you go. Got to be careful. So another kind of flashcard category, if you will, in this section, before we get to the, harder, more pain in the butt aspects of this section, is these basic economic principles of value, different things to consider in the value land: highest and best use, substitution, supply and demand, conformity, anticipation, contribution, competition, and change. And I've got all of these up here, so you will see them individually. We talked about highest and best use early on. It is this concept that a piece of land or piece of real property is being used for its maximum return on its investment. Is every property being used for its highest and best use? No. And the highest and best use can change. What was highest and best use at one time as farmland could now be highest and best use as, high density mixed use or something like that. So it can change. Substitution, folks, is basically this principle that if all things were equal, you're going to go for the lesser valued property, the one that costs less. That's the way that this kind of works. And I used to use this analogy, but it doesn't quite work because it's not equal to a lot of us. So I'd always say, are you a Coke or a Pepsi person? And a lot of people have an opinion, but to some of us, they're not equal. Okay. And so the premise here is, if you were looking at a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and that's all your requirement was in a certain zip code, and there was 2 that fit the bill perfectly for you, and one cost $500,000 and one cost $250,000, of course you're going to go for the $250,000 one. Why would you not? If they checked the same boxes for you, if they were the same to you, you're going to go for the cheaper option. Now, of course, that's not an absolute, because a 3-bedroom, 2-bath is very loosey-goosey. One could have much nicer finishes. One could have a lot more square footage, even though it only has 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. One could have a bigger lot. A lot of factors that may not make them equal. But if they were, the principle of substitution says you're going to go for the lower priced item out of these. And this kind of comes into play when we do a CMA, which we'll get into probably more than likely on Monday. So when we talk about supply and demand, economics 101, the more of something there is and the less buyers, the less valuable it is. The less of something there is, the more buyers, aka the more demand, the more valuable it is. We saw this in the housing market in COVID time. Interest rates hit record lows. We had more buyers than ever and cash buyers. And because of that competition, prices went way up because there was not enough homes to go around for the amount of buyers buying in that time frame. Of course, kind of seeing the opposite right now. There's a lot of well-qualified buyers, but they're not really as interested because the interest rates. And so a lot more inventory sitting home. The more inventory, the more competition, or the less competition, should we say, for buyers, and they get better deals. Now, conformity is kind of an interesting one. It is this premise that you maximize your value by being as similar as possible to everything else around you. As funny as that sounds, the way that you can basically think about this is it is not good to be the best house in an area or the worst house in an area. I'll give you a prime example of this. My dad lives in a very moderate neighborhood where like the houses are anywhere from like 1,100 square feet to like 1,700 or 1,800 square feet. And none of the houses had garages. At the time the neighborhood was built, it just wasn't a common thing. Most of them had big yards and sheds. And so recently he was talking to me, probably about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. He was talking to me about building a detached garage. And I looked at him and I said, you probably shouldn't. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, Dad, on average, a detached 2-car garage is going to cost you, once again, about 60 grand, depending, could be more. And because now there's like 3 homes in your neighborhood with a garage, you are all going to be the minority in that neighborhood. You're going to be overbuilt compared to the rest of the homes. And so you are going to see less of a return on your investment because you're the outlier. And this is true. I'll give you another example of this. I work for a developer and builder, and one of the co-owners ended up building himself like a over $1 million house in a neighborhood where the average price point was $500,000. He will never be able to sell it for what he put in that house because nobody wants to have the, $1.8 million house in the neighborhood of $500,000 houses. Nothing wrong with those houses, but it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. That's this principle of conformity. You maximize your value by being like everything else around you. Anticipation is a word you're all familiar with. It is the premise of something happening, good or bad, and causing changes. Anticipation in a good way would be like when people were talking about Apple coming when it was first announced. People were like, oh, it's going to bring, over 100 six-figure jobs to the area. It's going to help the economy. There's going to be a lot of, whatever. And so people were buying houses nearby in anticipation of it coming. Anticipation, there's also a Disney community coming to the Pittsburgh area, the Chatham Park area. A lot of people anticipating that. And so, of course, getting excited, already talking, trying to get on the wait list. Same thing, too. If a business is talking about closing down, that could really be a detriment to the economy. And so people may sell very fast in anticipation of a business going under or something like that. So it could be an increase or decrease based on what you think may happen, even though it hasn't happened yet. Now, this next one, and I would argue that this one is even a bigger factor for me personally in a CMA or BPO. It's called the principle of contribution. In other words, what does a certain feature of a property contribute to its value? Or in other words, what does lacking it take away? If we had 2 homes that were identical, one having a fireplace and one doesn't, well, what does that fireplace contribute in value to the one that does? Same thing too. One that doesn't have a garage versus one that does. What is the contribution? Or in other words, what value are we taking away by not having it? So that is the principle of contribution. last few here, competition. Of course, we kind of talked about that in supply and demand. The more competition there is, it can change things. Now, folks, there is competition that can drive up prices, but there's sometimes competition that can be so excessive that it's ruinous. Give you a real example, Airbnbs. There have been such a ramp up in short-term rentals where everybody and their grandmother hears that people are making good money. So they've been buying them up left and right. They've been turning them into Airbnbs, so much so that some municipalities have shut them down. And by shutting them down, then that means that nobody can have them anymore. Or even if they're not shutting them down, they may have so many in an area that they're all making like so much less money because the competition was so great that they all lost money because there's just too much competition. And of course, change is exactly what it sounds like. That is the only constant in life, is change. And the market, as we said, runs through cycles, goes up, levels off, runs up, levels off. Has been and will continue to do similar things like that for a while, as long as nothing crazy happens. But, economies change, desirability of areas change, weather changes. I mean, everything changes. So here's where I'm just going to mentally prepare you for what is going to be the biggest part of class on Monday. When we're dealing with an appraiser has three main approaches to valuing a property. That would be these three: the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and the income capitalization approach. And you would use these for different types of property. Sales comparison is commonly used to value, because we're talking about an appraiser, value a piece of residential property. In other words, sales comparison, we are looking at past sales and comparing them to a subject property. And because there's lots of data out there, that's the best way for residential. The cost approach is used for unique types of buildings that are not necessarily income producing, and there's not necessarily a lot of sales, and it's more often associated with insurance purposes, like how much value we need to insure it for. So a hospital, a church, a school, something like that, right? When was the last time you saw a hospital up for sale? Yeah. I mean, granted, you're probably not looking in the right place. It does happen, but it's just not so common that we could look at past sales. And so the premise is, what would it cost to rebuild it minus depreciation, add the value of the land back in? And then the income capitalization approach is basically taking a look at a property and valuing it based on how much money it makes. Not what it looks like, not how old it is, but how much money it makes. It's kind of like selling a business, because when you buy a business, you're buying the rights to future profits. Kind of like when, Disney bought Fox or Lucasfilms or something like that. They bought it for a lot of money because they now make all the money that those companies were making. So there are other aspects within these. I mean, I just kind of gave you the blanketed term that are absolutely terrible. And so full disclosure, we're going to go over it. I only have a few minutes left with you tonight because I promised to let you out early. We're going to go over it on Monday, but I can't spend a whole lot of time here because it's kind of like the financing chapter. You're just not going to get it after one time. So I'm going to explain it, but you may want to listen to the valuation section again, just because there's so many weird topics and overkill things and weird language and things of that nature. So this is where I told you, I would argue that a lot of this shouldn't even be in your curriculum. I really just don't think it should.